My son-in-law forgot his phone at my house. It rang, and on the screen appeared a photo of my wife who had passed away 5 years ago. When I opened the message, my heart almost stopped. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Bill Harrison, 70 years old, and I spent my entire life building an empire from the dirt up. Growing up in the south side of Chicago meant you had to fight for every dollar. I started with a single rusted cargo van and turned it into a commercial real estate firm worth $50 million. But inside my sprawling suburban home, the wealth I accumulated could not protect me from the ultimate betrayal. The nightmare started on a quiet Sunday evening. My daughter Sarah and her husband, Preston Crawford, had just left after our weekly family dinner. Sarah is 32, a kind-hearted woman who inherited the gentle spirit of her mother. But unfortunately, she also inherited a dangerous blind spot for manipulative people. Preston is 35, the current chief operating officer of my company. He is a smooth-talking executive with tailored suits and a smile that always felt just a little too practiced. The house was finally silent. I walked into the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water when I noticed a sleek black phone sitting on the marble island. Preston had left it behind. I shook my head, planning to call Sarah from my landline to let them know. But before I could reach for the receiver, the screen lit up. The phone vibrated violently against the granite countertop. I glanced down, expecting to see an email from a client. Instead, the breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. The caller identification displayed a name that I had not seen on a screen in half a decade. Martha. It was not just the name. The contact photo was a picture of my wife smiling her warm, beautiful smile. My wife who died 5 years ago from a sudden, unexplained neurological decline. My hands started to tremble. I picked up the device. A text message preview flashed across the locked screen. The words were burned into my retinas instantly. The old man signed the trust. Phase 2 complete. Tomorrow we bleed him dry. I stood frozen in the middle of my own kitchen. The silence of the large house suddenly felt suffocating. Bleed him dry. Phase 2 complete. I tried to process the sheer magnitude of those words. I swiped my thumb across the screen, desperately trying to unlock it, but a passcode prompt blocked my way. I typed in the birthday of Sarah. Incorrect. I typed in their wedding anniversary. Incorrect. Panic and fury began to war inside my chest. This was not a cruel prank. This was a calculated strike. Why would he have a contact saved under the name of my dead wife? Why would that specific contact be talking about a trust? Then, a sickening realization hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The trust. Just last week, I had sat in the office of my lawyer and signed over my medical and financial power of attorney to Preston and Sarah. I did not do it out of blind generosity. I did it out of fear. For the past 2 months, I had been experiencing terrifying dizzy spells. My vision would blur, my hands would shake, and a bone-deep fatigue would anchor me to my bed. Preston had been the one to insist I step back from the company. Preston had been the one bringing me a special herbal tea every night to help with my symptoms. Preston had introduced me to his private doctor, who suggested I get my affairs in order before my condition worsened. My mind raced back to 5 years ago. Martha had experienced the exact same symptoms: the dizzy spells, the sudden unexplainable weakness, the rapid decline. We thought it was a rare disease. We trusted the doctors. We trusted the private nurse that Preston had so helpfully recommended right after he started dating Sarah. My blood ran ice cold. I was not just looking at a man who wanted to steal my company. I was looking at a monster. Before I could fully grasp the horrifying implications of my thoughts, the piercing screech of tires echoing in the driveway shattered the silence. The heavy oak front door was flung open with violent force. Footsteps pounded against the hardwood floor of the hallway, moving with frantic, desperate speed. Preston was back. I had less than 3 seconds to make a choice. If I confronted him right now, I had no proof. The phone was locked. He held the power of attorney. If he realized I knew about his plan, he could easily call his doctor, declare me mentally unfit, and have me locked away in a facility by tomorrow morning. I had spent my entire life surviving cutthroat business deals. I knew that the man who strikes blindly always loses. I quickly placed the phone back on the marble island exactly where he had left it. I slumped my shoulders, narrowed my eyes, and let out a heavy, tired sigh, playing the exact role he expected me to play. The clueless, ailing old man. Preston burst into the kitchen. His face was pale, glistening with a cold sweat. His chest heaved as his eyes darted around the room. When his gaze landed on the phone sitting harmlessly on the counter, I saw a massive wave of relief wash over his features. "Oh, there it is," he gasped, forcing a nervous chuckle. I was halfway down the highway when I realized I left my phone. "You know how it is, Dad. I cannot survive without my work emails." I rubbed my temples and gave him a groggy, confused look. "You woke me up, Preston. I was just coming down here to get a glass of water. I did not even notice your phone. Make sure you lock the door on your way out." My head is spinning again. Preston grabbed the phone and shoved it deep into his coat pocket. His entire demeanor shifted instantly. The panic melted away, replaced by a smooth, predatory calmness. "Of course, Dad," he said, his voice dripping with a fake, sugary concern. "You just get some rest. Remember to drink the tea I left for you. You have a big day tomorrow. We want you healthy." I watched him walk out the door. The lock clicked shut. I stood alone in the dark kitchen. My hands were no longer trembling. The confusion was gone, replaced by a cold, calculated fury. Preston thought he was playing a game with a dying man. He thought he had outsmarted me. But he forgot one detail. He was standing inside the empire I built with my own 2 hands. He wanted to bleed me dry. But starting tonight, I was going to dismantle his life. The morning sun had barely risen over the cold Chicago skyline when I slowly pulled my car into the executive parking lot of Harrison Commercial Real Estate. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring up at the massive glass and steel tower that proudly bore my name. Nearly 40 years ago, this entire empire was nothing but a rusted pickup truck, a box of cheap tools, and a spiral notebook where my wife Martha kept our meager accounts. We ate canned soup for dinner, so we could afford to put gas in that truck. We skipped holidays, birthdays, and sleep to build a legacy from the absolute bottom. And now the man trusted to protect that legacy was sitting somewhere up there on the 30th floor, plotting to tear it all down. I took a long, deep breath, smoothing the lapels of my suit. My tired chest ached with a dull, heavy pressure, a lingering reminder of the dizzy spells that had plagued me for weeks. But I could not afford to be weak today. I walked through the double glass doors of the lobby, greeting the security guards with my usual firm nod. The elevator ride felt like an eternity. Every floor that ticked by was another second I had to bury the rage boiling inside my stomach. I stepped out onto the executive floor. The plush carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I made my way directly toward the office of the Chief Operating Officer. Preston. I did not knock. I pushed the heavy mahogany door open and stepped inside. Preston was sitting behind his massive desk, typing rapidly on his laptop. He looked up, a perfectly practiced look of mild surprise flashing across his handsome face. He immediately closed his laptop and stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Dad," he said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "You are here early. I thought the doctor told you to rest this morning." I waved my hand dismissively, forcing a tired but casual smile onto my face. "I am fine, Preston. Just getting old. Listen, the strangest thing happened last night after you came back from your phone." Paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to test his nerves. I watched his eyes. They remained perfectly still. No twitch, no panic. "What happened?" he asked, leaning forward with an expression of pure, attentive concern. I walked over to the leather chair opposite his desk and sat down slowly. "When you left your phone on the kitchen island, the screen lit up. I am not in the habit of snooping, but I glanced over. I saw a text message from a contact named Martha. It even had a picture of her. My Martha. The message said something about a trust and bleeding an old man dry. I let out a soft chuckle, rubbing my chin, as if the whole situation was merely a confusing joke. I assume it was some kind of horrible prank, but it shook me up a bit. Preston did not pale. He did not stutter. He did not break eye contact. Instead, his face contorted into a mask of deep frustration and anger. He let out a heavy sigh and ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry you had to see that," he said, his tone thick with righteous indignation. "I was hoping to get this sorted out before you found out." I frowned, playing the confused elder perfectly. "Sorted out? What do you mean?" Preston walked around his desk and sat in the chair right next to me, leaning in close like a protective son. "My phone was compromised yesterday afternoon," he explained, his voice low and serious. "I clicked on an email attachment I thought was from our legal department, but it was a sophisticated piece of malware. The scammers scraped my entire contact list, my photo gallery, and my recent search history. They are using artificial intelligence to generate these sickening phishing texts, trying to extort money from me by using the names of people I care about. They used Martha because they found her old photos in my cloud storage. They are threatening to wipe our corporate servers if I do not pay them a ransom." I stared at him. The lie was brilliant. It was technically sound, logical, and entirely plausible to a man of my generation. It perfectly explained the text, the photo, and the terrifying message. It painted him not as a traitor, but as a victim. I nodded slowly, letting my face relax into a mask of relief. "Good Lord," I muttered. "That is terrifying. Are our company accounts safe?" Before Preston could answer, the office door swung open. My daughter Sarah walked in holding a tray with 2 cups of coffee. She looked exhausted, her eyes lined with dark circles, but she managed a warm smile when she saw me. "Dad, what are you doing here?" she asked, setting the coffee down on the desk. "You should be resting at home. I told you we have everything handled." I looked at my daughter, the only innocent soul left in this room. "I just wanted to check in, sweetheart. Preston was just telling me about the phone hackers." Sarah sighed, placing a gentle hand on the shoulder of her husband. "It has been a nightmare, Dad. Preston was up until 4 in the morning, working with our cybersecurity team. He had them lock down the entire corporate network just to be safe. He has been so worried about protecting the company you and Mom built. He practically tore his hair out last night trying to secure the servers." I looked at Preston. He gave Sarah a humble, tired smile, patting her hand gently. "I just want to make sure the family is safe," he murmured. My stomach churned with a violent, nauseating rage. He was using the love of my daughter as a shield. He was using the legacy of my dead wife as a prop. I forced myself to smile back, standing up from the chair with a simulated groan of effort. "Well, I appreciate your hard work, Preston. Truly. I will head back to my office and take it easy today." I walked out, my heart hammering against my ribs. I closed the door behind me and walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway toward my private office. The plausible lie was flawless, but my gut screamed the truth. I closed my office door, locked it, and pulled out my personal cell phone. My hands felt cold as I opened my private banking application, the one account that held my personal retirement funds completely separate from the corporate trust. I typed in my username. I carefully entered my password. A red error message flashed across the screen. "Access denied." I tried again, typing slower this time, hoping for a simple mistake. Access denied. Password changed. The hacker excuse was not just a clever cover story for the bizarre text message I had seen. It was the perfect, undeniable alibi he needed to freeze my personal assets, permanently leaving me with nothing. I sat there, in the silence of my office, staring at the glowing screen of my phone until the red error message blurred before my eyes. The reality of my situation settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for men who have nothing to lose, and I was on the verge of losing everything I had spent my entire adult life building. I took a steady breath and dialed the direct unlisted number for my private wealth manager at the downtown branch. He answered on the second ring, his tone overly polite and laced with a nervous energy that told me he already knew why I was calling. I asked him point blank why my personal login credentials had been revoked. There was a long, uncomfortable pause on the other end of the line. He cleared his throat and told me that Preston had come into the bank personally just an hour ago. Preston had presented the newly minted, legally binding financial power of attorney. He told the bank that my digital security had been compromised in a massive cyber attack, and out of an abundance of caution. All my personal accounts needed to be frozen and secured under his direct administrative control. The bank manager apologized profusely, citing strict corporate protocol and his absolute legal obligation to follow the power of attorney document I had willingly signed just last week. I did not yell at the man. I did not threaten him or demand a reversal. I simply thanked him for his time and calmly ended the call. I placed the phone gently onto the polished wood of my desk. A profound, terrifying helplessness washed over me. I tried to stand up, wanting to walk over to the window to clear my head, but my legs suddenly refused to cooperate. A violent, crushing pressure seized my chest. The room began to tilt. The edges of my vision darkened, pulling inward, until all I could see was the dark surface of my desk. A severe dizzy spell, far worse than any I had experienced before, struck me with the force of a physical blow. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles turning white as I fought to stay conscious. My breathing became shallow and erratic. I felt a cold, clammy sweat break out across my forehead. This was not just stress. This was not the natural fatigue of an aging man dealing with a corporate crisis. My body was failing me, shutting down in a way that felt entirely unnatural. I closed my eyes and focused solely on drawing air into my lungs, waiting for the brutal vertigo to pass. As I sat there paralyzed by my own failing body, a memory cut through the thick fog of my mind. It was a memory of Preston standing in my kitchen just a few nights ago, his sleeves rolled up, a serene smile on his handsome face. For the past 2 months, my son-in-law had taken a sudden intense interest in my personal health. Every single night without fail, he would visit my house and brew me a special herbal supplement tea. He claimed it was an exclusive, imported blend designed to combat the natural signs of aging, to boost my immune system, and to clear my mental fog. He was always so incredibly insistent. He would stand there making casual conversation with Sarah, watching me closely until I finished every last drop in my favorite mug. He played the role of the devoted, caring son-in-law to absolute perfection. And I, in my blind, foolish desire to trust the man who married my only daughter, had drank it. Every single night. I had swallowed the bitter tea, and shortly after these dizzy spells had begun. They started small, just a brief moment of disorientation, but they had steadily grown in severity, leading up to the doctor visit, where I was convinced I was losing my grip on my own independence. The air in my office suddenly felt freezing cold. A horrifying parallel crashed into my consciousness, so sharp and devastating that it made my heart physically ache. 5 years ago, my beautiful Martha had sat in this exact same office, complaining of a strange, lingering fatigue. She started having sudden dizzy spells. She started dropping her pens, her hands trembling, just like mine were right now. We had visited the absolute best medical specialists in the city. but they could find no clear medical explanation for her rapid, terrifying decline. They called it a rare aggressive neurological condition. They told us there was nothing more we could do but keep her comfortable at home. I remembered the exact week her condition worsened. It was the exact same week Preston had smoothly inserted himself into our daily lives. He and Sarah had only been dating for a few months, but he was always around offering his support offering to help manage her care. I remembered with a sickening, terrifying clarity that it was Preston who had enthusiastically recommended the private round-the-clock nurse who took over the daily care of Martha, the nurse who managed all her medications, the nurse who controlled everything she consumed in those final agonizing months. I forced my eyes open. The vertigo was slowly beginning to recede, leaving behind a sharp, burning clarity in my mind. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with a horrifying precision. The text message on his phone, the contact name Martha, the powerful trust document, the frozen bank accounts, the severe dizzy spells, the nightly tea. Preston was not just a greedy corporate executive trying to steal my $50 million company. He was executing a calculated, methodical plan that he had already successfully tested 5 years ago. He was poisoning me slowly and legally right in front of the eyes of my own daughter. The sheer audacity of his betrayal was absolutely staggering. He had walked into my home, eaten at my table, and smiled at my daughter while methodically orchestrating my demise. He thought I was weak. He thought my age had made me vulnerable to his charming manipulation. But he was about to learn a very painful and highly unforgiving lesson. I pushed myself up from the leather chair, leaning heavily against the desk until my legs found their strength. I walked over to the small kitchenette in the corner of my private office. Sitting on the counter was the insulated metal thermos I brought from home every single morning. It contained the remainder of the tea Preston had brewed for me last night. I unscrewed the cap. The dark, earthy smell of the liquid drifted up, a smell I had grown so dangerously accustomed to. My hands were steady now. I opened a drawer, took out a sterile glass vial I kept for my travel medications, and carefully poured the dark liquid inside. I sealed the vial tight and slipped it into the breast pocket of my suit. I was no longer dealing with a thief. I might be living with a ruthless murderer. I needed an excuse to leave the office that Preston would welcome. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and asked my assistant to clear my afternoon schedule. I pitched my voice low to sound exhausted, mentioning a sudden cardiologist appointment. I knew Preston monitored my assistant and her logs. Within 10 minutes, he would know I was heading to the doctor, reinforcing his belief that his poison was working on schedule. I bypassed my usual luxury sedan and slid into an old gray sedan I kept for emergencies. I navigated the heavy afternoon traffic of Chicago, heading far away from the polished glass towers of the financial district. I drove south deep into the gritty industrial sector where the roads were cracked and the air smelled of diesel exhaust and damp concrete. This was the part of the city where I started my business 40 years ago, a place where people did not ask questions and luxury suits drew suspicious stares. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of a rundown diner, tucked between two massive abandoned shipping warehouses. The broken neon sign above the door buzzed with a faint hum. I walked inside. The diner was nearly empty, smelling of stale coffee and fried grease. Sitting in the furthest corner booth facing the entrance was Vincent Gallagher. Vince was a retired federal agent who spent 30 years dismantling organized crime syndicates before retiring. We had met 2 decades ago when he helped me clear my company name during a complex logistics audit. I was a man composed entirely of hard angles and cynical silence, drinking black coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. I slid into the vinyl booth across from him. Vince did not offer a warm greeting. He just looked at my pale face, my trembling hands, and the exhaustion radiating from my bones. He set his mug down and leaned forward, resting his massive forearms on the sticky table. "You look like a man walking to his own funeral, Bill. What kind of trouble are you in?" I reached into the breast pocket of my suit. My fingers brushed against the cold glass of the sterile vial. I pulled it out and set it on the table between us. The dark, earthy liquid swirled inside the glass. "I need you to run a rush toxicology panel on this," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind. "I need to know exactly what heavy metals, toxins, or chemical agents are in that liquid. And I need the results yesterday." Vince stared at the vial for a long moment. He did not touch it right away. His trained eyes shifted from the dark liquid back to my face, reading the terrifying implications written in my expression. "Who gave this to you?" he asked, his tone dropping an octave. "My son-in-law," I replied flatly. "He has been brewing it for me every night for 2 months. He calls it a wellness supplement. I call it the reason my nervous system is shutting down." I watched the realization hit Vince. He knew about Martha. He knew how she died. His jaw tightened, and he finally reached out, wrapping his large, calloused hand around the glass vial and slipping it carefully into his jacket. "Consider it done. I will wake up my guy at this private lab. But Bill, if you really think the kid is poisoning you, why are you sitting in a greasy diner with me? You need to walk into a precinct right now. Let the police tear his life apart." I shook my head, tapping my fingers nervously against the table. "I cannot go to the police, Vince. Not yet. Preston is not just a greedy kid making a sloppy play for my money. He is incredibly methodical. Last week, when my symptoms peaked, he convinced me to sign over full medical and financial power of attorney. He has completely legally locked me out of my own private bank accounts as of this morning, claiming he is protecting me from a cyber attack. He has total control. If I go to the authorities right now with a crazy story about poisoned tea and a text message I cannot even prove exists, he will counter my claims instantly. He will bring in his high-priced lawyers and his hand-picked doctors. They will point to my failing health, label me paranoid and mentally incompetent, and use the very documents I signed to lock me in a secure psychiatric ward. He will take my company, my daughter, and my freedom in one swift legal motion." Vince cursed softly under his breath, leaning back against the vinyl seat. "He has you boxed in completely. A perfect legal cage." "Exactly," I said. "That is why I need you to do more than just test that tea. I need you to tear into his financial history. Dig into his private accounts, his offshore holdings, his shell companies. There is absolutely no way a man orchestrates a slow murder just to inherit a corporate position. He needs capital. He needs liquid cash. I want to know where every single dime he has stolen from my company is going. I want to know who his partners are. I want to know everything he is hiding behind that tailored suit." Vince nodded slowly, pulling out a small notepad. "Give me 48 hours. I will trace his digital footprint back to the day he was born. But you have a massive problem right now, Bill. If he has the power of attorney and he has already frozen your personal assets, what is stopping him from liquidating the main corporate trust tomorrow morning? He could wire the company funds offshore board a private jet with his mistress and leave you here to die." A cold chill swept through my chest. Vince was absolutely right. Preston had the keys to the text message had clearly stated that Phase 2 was complete, and tomorrow they were going to bleed me dry. He was preparing to execute the final financial drain within 24 hours. I could not fight him in court, and I could not outrun his legal authority. I stared down at my empty hands, the panic threatening to rise again. But then a dangerous, brilliant thought cut through the fear. Preston was a predator, but like all predators, he was driven by an insatiable, blinding greed. He wanted my $50 million company, but if he thought there was even more money hidden away, Johnny, he could not access without my willing cooperation. He would hesitate. He would pause his entire operation just to get his hands on a larger prize. I looked up at Vince, a slow, grim smile forming on my lips. "He is not going to touch the corporate trust tomorrow," I said quietly. Vince raised an eyebrow. How can you be so sure of that? Because tonight at dinner, I am going to feed him a lie, so massive, so incredibly lucrative, that he will have no choice but to keep me alive and comfortable. I am going to trap him in his own greed. I left the diner and drove back to my sprawling suburban estate, mentally rehearsing the performance of my life. For 4 decades, I had sat across negotiation tables from ruthless corporate raiders, cutthroat developers, and corrupt city officials. I knew how to read a room, how to mask my intentions, and how to exploit the weaknesses of my opponents. Preston thought he was playing a master game of chess against a dying, oblivious old man. I had no idea he was stepping into a trap built by a man who had survived the most brutal business environments in Chicago. I knew he had spent the entire day quietly plotting my absolute ruin, completely convinced that I was nothing more than a helpless, broken old fool. He drastically underestimated my relentless willpower. I had crushed significantly stronger men than him just to fiercely protect my family, and I would gladly do it again tonight. I pulled into my long, winding driveway, parked the car inside the expansive garage, and took a long, deep breath to steady my racing heart. I deliberately slumped my shoulders, letting my spine curve just enough to project an image of sheer, undeniable physical exhaustion. I let my hands tremble just slightly as I unlocked the heavy front door. The rich, comforting smell of roasted chicken and fresh garlic filled the warm hallway. Sarah and Preston were in the dining room, setting the large mahogany table for our usual weekday family dinner. Preston looked up the exact second I entered the room. His cold, calculating eyes immediately scanned my posture, my face and my hands, looking for the visible signs of weakness his daily poison was supposed to be causing. I gave him exactly what he wanted to see. I leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, let out a long, ragged sigh, and rubbed my temples as if I was fighting off a sudden, intense wave of dark, disorienting confusion. Sarah rushed over to me immediately, her beautiful face pale with genuine concern. She gently took my wool coat from my shaking hands and carefully guided me toward my chair at the head of the dining table. Preston followed closely behind her, pulling out my seat with that sickening, practiced smile of a devoted son. He poured me a glass of iced water, gently reminding me to stay hydrated after my doctor appointment. I sat down heavily, letting my hand shake violently as I reached across the tablecloth for the glass. We ate our meal in silence for the first 20 minutes. I picked at my roasted chicken, keeping my gaze lowered to my plate, playing the part of a man whose mind was slowly slipping away into the fog of age and terminal illness. Finally, I set my fork down on the plate and looked across the table directly at my daughter. I pitched my voice low, making it sound fragile, broken, and vulnerable. I told Sarah that my appointment with the specialist today had made me realize just how fast my physical health was declining. I told her I wanted to make sure that every aspect of my legacy was perfectly in order before I lost my mental ability to manage the massive family estate. Then I turned my gaze slowly toward Preston and dropped the bait. I told them that my mind had been so scattered lately I had completely forgotten to mention a massive, unrecorded offshore bank account I set up decades ago. I watched the exact moment the financial information registered in the brain of my son-in-law. I explained in a quiet tone that back in the early days of building the commercial real estate firm, I had secretly funneled corporate profits into a private Cayman Islands account. I told them I did this to ensure my late wife would be protected if the business ever went bankrupt. I told them the secret account had sat untouched, gathering compound interest for over 30 years. It was currently holding a liquid cash value of $15 million. I let the number hang heavily in the quiet air above the dinner table. $15 million of untraceable cash waiting to be claimed. Preston stopped chewing his food. The fork in his hand hovered still above his plate. His dark eyes, which were usually so carefully guarded and calm, widened with a sudden flash of pure greed. It was a terrifying physical reaction, a hunger so deep and predatory that it practically radiated from his skin like heat from a furnace. I continued my performance, telling them that since Preston now held the financial power of attorney, I wanted him to help me execute a wire transfer of that $15 million into the main corporate trust next week. I told him I wanted everything consolidated under his legal control, so Sarah would never have to worry about a financial burden after I was gone. The absolute psychological transformation inside Preston was immediate and flawlessly predictable. The violent criminal timeline he had confidently texted to his mysterious accomplice last night, the ruthless calculated plan to bleed my corporate accounts dry, by tomorrow morning completely vanished from his mind in a single instant. His overwhelming obsessive greed had completely overridden his normally methodical caution. He leaned forward across the large table, placing a warm, reassuring hand directly over mine, his voice dripping with eager compliance. He told me it was a truly brilliant, secure idea, praising my financial foresight and promising to personally handle all the complex international transfer paperwork by next Wednesday afternoon. He had swallowed the massive bait perfectly, hook, line, and sinker. I had successfully bought myself the extremely crucial, life-saving amount of time I desperately needed to dismantle his entire fraudulent life. The rest of the long family dinner passed with Preston floating in a state of barely concealed manic euphoria. He happily poured me my nightly ceramic cup of the poisoned herbal tea, which I carefully pretended to drink, while secretly pouring the deadly liquid into a large potted plant sitting right beside my heavy dining chair. By 10 o'clock, they finally left the house, leaving me completely alone in the creeping dark. I sat silently in my private study, staring blankly at the antique grandfather clock, slowly ticking away the midnight hours. The sprawling silence of the empty house felt suffocatingly heavy, incredibly thick with the terrifying anticipation of total war. I simply waited in the shadows. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my secure cellular phone suddenly vibrated on the wooden desk. I answered it immediately. The rough, grim voice of Vincent Gallagher filled the quiet room. "Bill," he said slowly, "the emergency lab results on the tea just came back. You need to sit down right now. It is thallium, heavy metal poison, highly toxic, incredibly difficult to trace without a highly specific targeted blood panel, and absolutely guaranteed to cause slow, agonizing neurological failure, resulting in certain death. And Bill, that is not all. I dug incredibly deep into the digital footprint of that encrypted text message. I found out exactly who owns the secret burner phone currently operating under the name Martha." I gripped the edge of my heavy wooden desk as the words from Vincent Gallagher echoed in the dead silence of my study. Thallium. The name of the heavy metal poison hung in the air like a physical entity, toxic, cold, and utterly suffocating. My mind raced, struggling to process the sheer calculated cruelty of it all. Preston was not just slowly sedating me or trying to make me look incompetent to steal a company. He was meticulously executing a painful, invisible murder right inside my own home, hiding behind a warm smile and a ceramic mug of tea. The revelation was so profoundly evil that it temporarily robbed me of my ability to speak or even breathe properly. I simply sat there in the dark, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock, marking the seconds of a life I was supposed to be losing. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the air into my tight lungs, and asked Vince to tell me about the burner phone. I desperately needed to know exactly who was sitting on the other end of that terrifying text message waiting to bleed me dry. Vince did not hesitate for a single second. His voice was grim, stripped of all emotion, as he delivered the next devastating blow to my reality. He told me that tracing a prepaid cellular device was usually a dead end, but the person using it had made a critical, arrogant mistake. They had used the untraceable phone to log into a secure, private wireless network at a luxury high-rise building in downtown Chicago. Vince had pulled the property records and cross-referenced the network data with astonishing speed. The phone belonged to a woman named Diana. The name hit my chest like a hollow-point bullet. Diana. The memory of her face materialized in the dark corners of my study with sickening clarity. 5 years ago, when the mystery illness first began to ravage my beautiful Martha, Preston had stepped up as the absolute hero of the family. He had used his vast network of medical contacts to find us the absolute best private care available in the entire state. He brought Diana into our home. She was a highly recommended, incredibly professional private nurse who practically moved into our guest room to meticulously manage the daily medications and dietary needs of my dying wife. Diana had been the one to sit by the bed for countless hours, gently stroking the hair of my wife, while her body wasted away from what the baffled doctors called an aggressive, untreatable neurological decline. The room began to spin violently, not from the poison this time, but from the crushing, unbearable weight of the awful truth. Martha did not die of a rare disease. My Martha was brutally murdered. She was slowly, systematically poisoned in her own bed by the very woman I paid a fortune to protect her, orchestrated by the man who was sleeping next to my only daughter. The motive suddenly became terrifyingly abundantly clear. Martha held a massive block of founding shares in the company, and she was fiercely protective of our corporate structure. She never completely trusted Preston with the business. By eliminating her, her massive shares automatically passed to Sarah, who blindly signed over her voting rights to her new loving husband. That tragic, heartbreaking death was the exact catalyst that formally secured Preston his dominant position as the chief operating officer. He had coldly used the agonizing murder of my beloved wife as a simple stepping stone for his corporate career. And now that I was the only remaining obstacle between him and total financial control, he and Diana had simply dusted off their successful murderous playbook to finish the job. Vince continued speaking through the speaker, his rough voice anchoring me to reality as the fragile edges of my sanity began to fray and snap. He revealed that Preston and Diana were not just secret accomplices in murder. They were romantic partners who had been living a complete sickening double life for over 6 years. Vince had uncovered a hidden shell corporation meticulously registered in the state of Delaware. That anonymous corporate entity was used to purchase an $8 million luxury penthouse suite in the exact same downtown building where the burner phone had pinged the network. Preston was leaving the warm bed of my innocent daughter every single morning to confidently run my empire, and spending his stolen afternoons lounging in a sprawling penthouse with the woman who helped him execute my wife. A dark, primal fury ignited deep inside my aging bones. It was a violent, consuming fire that completely burned away every single ounce of my physical exhaustion. I did not feel like a frail 70-year-old man anymore. I felt like a father who had welcomed a rabid wolf into his home and foolishly allowed it to slaughter his flock. My breathing grew incredibly ragged and heavy in the otherwise totally silent room. I slowly stood up from my massive wooden desk, my fists clenched together so tightly that my fingernails dug painfully into my palms. I stared intensely at the heavy brass letter opener resting on the polished wood of my massive desk, feeling the cold metal calling out to me. I told Vince I was going to hang up the phone right now. I told him I was going to walk out to my garage, get into my car, and drive directly to the house of my daughter. I was going to pull Preston out of his comfortable bed, drag him down the hardwood stairs, and beat the absolute life out of him with my bare hands until he confessed to what he did to my wife. I wanted to hear him beg for his miserable life, just like Martha must have suffered in silence. I was fully ready to throw away my freedom, my company, and my remaining years, just to watch the light fade from his treacherous, lying eyes. But Vince stopped me instantly. His voice cracked through the phone like a physical whip, sharp and overwhelmingly commanding. He told me to sit back down in my chair and listen to him very carefully before I made a fatal mistake. He warned me that killing Preston tonight would only destroy Sarah, leaving her traumatized and completely vulnerable to the massive legal fallout of his hidden crimes. Vince told me that the poison and the luxury penthouse were barely scratching the surface of this expansive nightmare. He urged me to look past the murder for just 1 minute and focus heavily on the corporate files he had just finished decrypting. The corporate embezzlement was drastically worse than either of us could have ever imagined in our worst fears. Vince took a slow, heavy breath before delivering the final chilling piece of the puzzle. He told me that Preston owed a staggering amount of money to people who make ordinary murderers look like innocent choir boys. If I let my anger win tonight, those incredibly dangerous people would inevitably come looking for my daughter to collect his massive unpaid debts. I had to be perfectly strategic. I forced myself to breathe, releasing my tight grip on the heavy brass letter opener. I asked Vince to explain exactly what he meant by dangerous people. Vince let out a slow, heavy sigh through the phone receiver, the kind of sigh a man makes when he is about to deliver a death sentence. He told me that over the last 48 hours, he had completely bypassed the standard financial firewalls of my company. He had dug into the encrypted logistics logs and the secondary property deeds that Preston thought were perfectly hidden. My son-in-law had not just been skimming profits off the top of our quarterly earnings. He had quietly leveraged 5 of my largest commercial shipping warehouses located on the south side of the city. He used them as physical collateral to secure massive off-the-books loans from a shadow lending firm. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked Vince who was running the shadow firm. Vince told me it was not a traditional firm at all. It was a front operation for a notorious transnational syndicate that manufactured and distributed synthetic narcotics. Preston had taken their dirty money to fund his lavish hidden lifestyle and his luxury penthouse with Diana. But the syndicate did not just want their money paid back with interest. They wanted a reliable, legitimate transportation network to move their highly illegal chemical precursors across state lines without drawing the attention of federal highway inspectors. Preston had willingly handed over the keys to my entire logistics fleet. He was currently using my clean, highly respected corporate trucks to run daily shipments for one of the most violent cartels operating in North America. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal threatened to pull me under. Vince continued, his voice tight with urgent warning. He told me that Preston had gotten sloppy over the past few months. He had mismanaged the logistics schedules and lost a crucial shipment of chemicals to a random highway patrol seizure. The cartel held Preston personally responsible for the lost revenue and the seized product. Vince had intercepted a series of highly encrypted emails proving that Preston was currently $8 million in debt to the syndicate. They had given him an absolute deadline to pay back the money or face severe fatal consequences. That deadline was at the end of this month. The entire sickening master plan finally unrolled before my eyes in vivid, terrifying detail. The puzzle was complete. Preston was drowning in cartel debt and desperate for a massive infusion of untraceable cash. That was exactly why he had accelerated his poisoning schedule. He was going to use the power of attorney to completely drain my corporate trust, quietly pay off his staggering $8 million debt to the cartel and pocket the rest of the stolen fortune. Then, he would simply wait for my failing heart to give out from the heavy metal toxins accumulating in my blood. He would stand at my funeral wearing a black suit and holding the hand of my grieving daughter, playing the perfect, devastated son-in-law. But the absolute darkest part of his plan was what he intended to do to Sarah. Once I was buried in the ground and the money was secured in offshore accounts, Preston was going to pack his bags and vanish into a non-extradition country with Diana. He would leave Sarah completely alone to inherit the poisoned crown of the logistics empire. When the federal authorities eventually caught wind of the drug trafficking network, or when the cartel decided they needed more favors, Sarah would be the one sitting in the chief executive chair. My innocent, trusting daughter would be left holding the bag. She would be the one facing decades in federal prison for international drug trafficking, or worse, facing the brutal retaliation of the cartel. I thanked Vince for his incredible work and told him to get some sleep. I hung up the phone and sat in the profound silence of my study until the golden rays of dawn began to creep through the thick curtains. I had spent the entire night confronting the darkness, and I had emerged with a terrifying clarity of purpose. I showered, put on my best tailored suit, and drove to the corporate headquarters. I needed to play my role perfectly. I walked into the busy executive lobby just before 9 o'clock, greeting my staff with a warm, steady smile. I made my way up to the executive floor and walked directly toward the office of my son-in-law. I wanted to see the face of a man who believed he had won. As I approached the heavy glass door of his office, my assistant flagged me down. She whispered that Preston was currently in an unscheduled, highly confidential meeting with a potential new private investor who had arrived unannounced just 10 minutes ago. She said the man had refused to provide a business card and insisted on speaking only to the chief operating officer. I thanked her and quietly approached the office. The blinds were partially drawn, but a small gap allowed me to look inside. Preston was standing behind his desk. His posture was rigid, his shoulders drawn up near his ears. Sitting casually in the leather guest chair was a man I did not recognize. He wore a sharp suit, but his thick neck and scarred knuckles told a completely different story. The man was speaking in a very low, calm tone, but the physical effect his words were having on Preston was absolutely undeniable. I watched a single drop of sweat trace its way down the pale cheek of my son-in-law. Preston nodded frantically, his hands planted firmly on his desk to hide their violent trembling. The man slowly stood up, adjusted his expensive tie, and offered Preston a cold, mocking smile before turning toward the door. I quickly stepped back into the hallway, pretending to be deeply engrossed in a financial report on my phone as the cartel enforcer walked out of the office and passed me toward the elevators. The man did not even glance in my direction. He was an apex predator moving through a forest of sheep. I waited until the elevator doors closed before I stepped into the office. Preston was still standing behind his desk, staring blankly at the wall, struggling to catch his breath. I smiled warmly and asked him if the meeting went well. He jumped, startled by my voice, and quickly forced that sickening fake smile back onto his face. He told me it was just a minor logistical issue with a new client. I nodded, telling him I was looking forward to transferring the $15 million next week so he could handle these stressful clients with more financial freedom. The overwhelming relief that washed over his face was pathetic. He was a cornered rat desperately clinging to a piece of poisoned cheese. I turned and walked back to my office. Handing my son-in-law to the police was not enough to protect my family. I needed the cartel to destroy him. I walked back to my empty office, my mind moving with cold precision. I needed the cartel to destroy him. Time was the one resource Preston was rapidly running out of. The visit from the cartel enforcer had clearly rattled him. His timeline had been violently accelerated, and I knew his desperation would make him reckless. I sat at my desk reviewing operational reports, waiting for the inevitable knock on my door. Barely an hour passed before Preston walked into my office. I was holding a thick manila folder, his smooth stride replaced by a rigid energy. "Dad," he said, his voice tight with forced enthusiasm. "I have been working with our international banking liaisons all morning. I managed to expedite the paperwork for the Cayman Islands transfer. If we get your signature on these authorization forms right now, we can initiate the wire process before the overseas markets close today." He laid the thick stack of papers on my desk, sliding a silver pen toward my hand. I stared down at the documents. The trap was closing faster than I had anticipated. If I signed those papers, Preston would immediately discover that the $15 million account was a fabrication. His leverage would vanish, his desperation would peak, and he would likely increase my daily dose of poison to lethal levels by tonight. If I simply refused to sign, he would know I was stalling, potentially triggering his backup plan to have me declared mentally incompetent. I was completely boxed in. I needed a diversion. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket, my fingers brushing against a small foil-wrapped tablet. Vince anticipated Preston might try forcing my hand early. He had given me a highly specialized prescription medication, a potent beta blocker designed to rapidly drop blood pressure and induce the physical symptoms of a massive cardiovascular event without causing actual permanent damage to the heart. It was a very dangerous theatrical prop, but it was the only card I had left to play. I looked up at Preston, offering him a weak, appreciative smile. "You always work so incredibly hard for this family, Preston. Let me just grab a glass of water to wash down my morning vitamins, and I will sign whatever you need." I slowly stood up, turning my back to him, as I walked toward the small kitchenette in the corner of my office. My hands were shaking, but this time the tremor was born of pure adrenaline. I unwrapped the small tablet, popped it into my mouth, and swallowed it down with a large gulp of cold water. I turned back around, taking a slow step toward the desk. Vince had warned me that the physical reaction would be nearly instantaneous and incredibly violent. He was not exaggerating at all. Before I could even reach the leather chair, the floor beneath my feet seemed to vanish entirely. A massive wave of dizziness slammed into my brain. The wooden walls blurred into a chaotic streak of colors. My knees buckled beneath my weight. I collapsed hard onto the thick carpet, the impact sending a shockwave through my aging bones. I gasped for air, clutching my chest as my heart rate intentionally plummeted. My breathing became ragged and shallow, mimicking the terrifying struggle of a man dying right on the floor of his own empire. I let my eyes roll back slightly, keeping them just open enough to see through the narrow slits of my eyelids. This was the moment of absolute horrifying truth. I was lying completely helpless at the feet of the man who had married my daughter. A normal human being, a man with even a single shred of empathy, would have dropped to his knees, shouted for medical help, and scrambled for a phone. Preston did absolutely none of those things. He stood perfectly still behind my desk. I watched him through the haze of my blurred vision. He slowly lowered the silver pen onto the table. He did not rush toward me. He did not call my name. He simply stood there, towering over my fallen body, staring down at me with an expression of cold, detached fascination. His dark eyes were entirely devoid of fear or sorrow. They were the eyes of a butcher watching a wounded animal slowly bleed out. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the ragged sounds of my own staged breathing. I watched as Preston calmly raised his left wrist, checking the time on his expensive silver watch. He was deliberately timing my suffering. He was waiting to see if my heart would simply give out on its own, saving him the trouble of administering the final dose of heavy metal poison. He stood there in complete terrifying silence for one full, agonizing minute. 60 long seconds where he casually watched the father of his wife struggle for air. Only when he was absolutely certain that I was not going to die. Immediately did he finally let out a frustrated sigh, pick up the desk phone, and calmly dial for an ambulance. The sheer ruthlessness of his hesitation solidified every dark plan I had made. The next few hours dissolved into a chaotic blur of blaring sirens, blinding hospital lights, and shouting medical personnel. I played my role flawlessly, remaining entirely unresponsive, as the emergency room doctors poked, prodded, and stabilized my artificially depressed vitals. When the agonizing effects of the medication finally began to wear off, leaving me exhausted but lucid, I kept my eyes firmly closed and my breathing shallow. I was lying in a private, dimly lit hospital room. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound cutting through the sterile air. I could feel the soft, warm weight of a hand resting gently over mine. It was Sarah. I could hear her soft crying beside the bed. The hospital room door slowly creaked open. The footsteps of my son-in-law echoed against the linoleum floor. I felt Preston approach the bed, standing behind my daughter. He placed his hands gently on her trembling shoulders, playing the devoted husband to perfection. Sarah leaned back into his embrace, her voice thick with profound grief. "The doctors say his heart is incredibly weak, Preston," she whispered, her tears falling onto my hand. "They do not know if he is going to wake up this time. I am so scared of losing him, just like we lost Mom." Preston gently stroked the hair of my daughter, leaning his head down close to hers. I kept my eyes shut, my heart hammering against my ribs, waiting for his response. He kissed the top of her head, his voice dropping into a soft, soothing whisper that sent a violent, freezing chill straight down to the marrow of my bones. "Do not worry about a thing, sweetheart," he murmured softly, his tone dripping with a dark promise. I am going to take care of everything for us. As soon as he signs the Cayman papers, I will increase his dosage. It will all be over very soon, honey. His long and painful struggle will finally end forever. The white ceiling of my hospital room was the first thing I saw when I opened my eyes. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was a constant reminder of the lethal game I was playing. I spent the night listening to the steady breathing of my daughter as she slept in the plastic chair next to my bed. She had refused to leave my side. Preston stayed just long enough to put on a show of grief before claiming he needed to return to the office to manage the crisis. I knew exactly what crisis he was managing. He was preparing to drain my life's work. I waited until the attending physician entered the room before I began my performance. I weakly pushed myself up against the pillows, letting my hands tremble as I grabbed the blanket. I pitched my voice low, making it sound desperately frail. I told the doctor that I absolutely refused to spend my final days trapped in a hospital bed. I insisted on signing the release papers against his strict medical advice. The doctor argued with me, warning me my heart was unstable, but I remained utterly stubborn. Sarah squeezed her hand and told her I wanted to sleep at home. My acting was flawless because the pain behind it was entirely real. By 10 in the morning, Sarah was driving me back to my suburban estate. Preston was locked away in his office, reviewing the Cayman transfer documents he believed I would sign tonight. I told Sarah I needed silence to rest, convincing her to run errands and take her mind off the stress. As soon as the taillights of her car disappeared down the long driveway, my fragile demeanor vanished completely. I stood up straight, grabbed a heavy winter coat, and walked out the back door. Vince was waiting for me in his gray sedan 2 blocks away from my estate. I slid into the passenger seat without saying a single word. He put the car in gear and we headed toward the glass skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. The drive was tense and silent. My mind was focused entirely on the massive risk we were about to take. We were driving directly into the hidden nest of a killer. Vince navigated the city traffic with the calm precision of a man who spent 30 years hunting the worst kinds of predators. We pulled into the underground parking garage of a luxury residential tower located along the river. This was the building where the burner phone had connected to the private network. This was the expensive fortress Preston had purchased with the money he stole from my family. Vince pulled a small, heavy canvas bag from the back seat. He told me to stay close and let him handle the security cameras. We bypassed the main lobby entirely using a secondary service elevator that Vince had already scouted. We rode in complete silence up to the penthouse floor. When the metal doors slid open, we stepped into a private marble hallway. Vince approached the heavy oak door of the penthouse. He pulled an electronic bypass tool from his bag, attaching it to the digital keypad lock. It took him less than 40 seconds to crack the code. The lock clicked open with a soft, barely audible thud. We stepped inside and silently closed the door behind us. The sheer opulence of the penthouse hit me like a physical blow. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. Expensive modern art hung on the walls. Custom Italian furniture filled the living room. Every inch was bought with the blood of my wife and the stolen profits of my work. We did not have time to dwell on the anger. Vince signaled for me to follow him down the hallway toward the master bedroom. The room was immaculate, smelling faintly of an expensive floral perfume. Diana. The scent alone made my stomach turn with a violent disgust. Vince went to work running his hands expertly along the edges of the walk-in closet and the panels behind the bed. It took him less than 3 minutes to find it. Hidden behind a heavy framed mirror was a steel wall safe. Vince pulled a small drill and a digital stethoscope from his canvas bag. He told me to stand back and keep quiet. I watched in tense fascination as the retired federal agent meticulously manipulated the locking mechanism. He was a ghost, dismantling the secrets of a monster. After 5 agonizing minutes of absolute silence, the heavy steel door finally swung open. Vince stepped back, gesturing for me to look inside. I stepped forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sitting on the middle shelf of the safe was a thick black leather ledger. Resting right next to it was a small, padded protective case. My hands shook as I reached past the ledger and opened the case. Inside were 3 small glass vials filled with a clear, odorless liquid. Thallium, the exact same heavy metal poison that slowly destroyed the nervous system of my Martha. The exact same poison that had been sitting in my ceramic mug just 24 hours ago. I closed the case, my vision blurring with a blinding rage. Vince grabbed the black leather ledger and flipped through the handwritten pages. He let out a low, grim whistle. "This is it, Bill," he whispered, his voice tight with victory. "This is the secondary set of books. He is tracking every illegal cartel shipment through your warehouses right here. There are dates, specific chemical weights, and offshore routing numbers. He also has forged property deeds in here, transferring ownership of your logistics hubs directly into his shell company. This is the absolute mother lode. We have enough hard evidence in this safe to put both him and Diana away for the rest of their miserable lives." I placed my hand firmly over the open pages of the black ledger. The satisfaction of securing the physical evidence was intoxicating. We had completely dismantled his legal fortress. We had the poison, the financial records, and the proof. I told Vince to pack everything into his bag immediately. We needed to wipe our fingerprints from the safe, close the mirror, and disappear before Preston realized his criminal empire was collapsing. Vince shoved the vials of poison and the thick leather ledger into his bag. He zipped it shut and turned toward the heavy bedroom door to check the hallway. Before he could take a step forward, the terrifying sound of the front door unlocking echoed sharply through the quiet penthouse. The heavy oak door swung open with a loud thud. The distinct click of high heels stepping onto the marble floor sent a paralyzing jolt straight down my spine. A woman hummed a soft, cheerful tune as she tossed her keys onto the entryway table. It was Diana. She had returned to the penthouse hours earlier than we anticipated. The cheerful humming grew steadily louder as her footsteps moved slowly down the long hallway, heading directly toward the master bedroom. Vince locked eyes with me, his expression grim. There was no secondary exit. We were completely trapped. The cheerful humming grew steadily louder as her footsteps moved slowly down the long hallway, heading directly toward the master bedroom. My heart slammed against my ribs with the force of a sledgehammer. We were standing perfectly still in the center of the lavish room. There was nowhere to hide. The massive walk-in closet was situated too close to the doorway, and slipping beneath the custom bed was physically impossible for a man of my age. Vince locked eyes with me. His face was a mask of cold, professional focus. He did not panic. He silently pointed a single thick finger toward the large glass doors leading out to the private balcony. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back just enough to allow an escape. I nodded once. We moved with agonizing caution. Every step I took across the thick, plush carpet felt like walking on broken glass. My muscles ached terribly from the physical toll of the medication I had taken earlier in the morning, but the pure adrenaline coursing through my veins masked the pain. Vince reached the balcony doors first. He grasped the brushed steel handle and turned it with agonizing slowness, preventing the heavy latch from making even the slightest mechanical click. The cold autumn wind instantly rushed into the room as he pulled the glass door open just wide enough for us to slip through. The footsteps in the hallway were just feet away now. I squeezed through the narrow opening, stepping out onto the cold concrete of the balcony. Vince followed immediately right behind me. He pulled the glass door shut, leaving it unlatched by a fraction of an inch to avoid the loud snap of the locking mechanism. We pressed our backs firmly against the freezing brick wall of the building, completely hidden from the interior view. Less than 2 seconds later, the heavy wooden door of the master bedroom swung fully open. Through the narrow gap in the curtains, I could see Diana walk into the room. She was holding a shopping bag and humming a bright, joyful melody. She carelessly tossed her designer purse onto the pristine white duvet. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that the men who held her absolute destruction in a canvas bag were standing mere inches away on the other side of the glass. She walked toward the master bathroom, leaving the bedroom empty for a fleeting moment. Vince tapped my shoulder. He pointed to the rusted iron fire escape attached to the side of the balcony railing. We had no other choice. I grabbed the freezing iron railing and hoisted myself over the side. The wind howled violently around us as we began the treacherous descent. My aging joints screamed in protest with every single step down the steep, narrow metal stairs. I focused entirely on the broad back of my old friend moving steadily below me. We descended 4 long flights of stairs before reaching the dark, narrow alleyway behind the luxury high-rise. My boots hit the wet pavement, and I finally allowed myself to take a deep, ragged breath. We had made it. We were completely undetected, and we held the definitive proof of their monstrous betrayal. We hurried down the alley and climbed into his unmarked gray sedan. Vince threw the heavy canvas bag onto the back seat and slammed his hands against the steering wheel. He let out a sharp, breathless laugh of pure adrenaline. He turned to me, his eyes wide with intense urgency. He told me that we had everything we needed right now. He wanted to drive the car directly to the regional headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He insisted we lay the poison, the secondary ledger, and the forged property deeds right on the desk of a federal prosecutor. He promised me that Preston and Diana would be locked inside a maximum security holding cell before the sun went down. I stared out the passenger window at the passing city skyline. I shook my head slowly. I told Vince to drive away from the downtown district and find a quiet place to park. He looked at me as if I had lost my mind, but he put the car in gear and navigated toward an empty industrial park near the river. When he finally turned off the engine, I turned to him and spoke with a cold, unrelenting, absolute certainty. I told him we could not involve the authorities yet. I explained the harsh reality of the legal system to my old friend. If we handed the evidence over to the federal authorities today, Preston would be formally arrested, but he would immediately deploy an army of highly paid corporate defense attorneys. He would inevitably secure bail. He would use his frozen control of my massive estate to fund a brutal, protracted legal war that could drag on for years, but that was not the most terrifying part of the equation. The true danger was the cartel. I reminded Vince about the $8 million debt Preston owed to the ruthless synthetic drug syndicate. If Preston was publicly arrested, the cartel would instantly realize their entire chemical transportation network was compromised. They would panic. They would completely eradicate any loose ends tied to my logistics firm to protect their shadow operation. And the biggest loose end was the woman currently sleeping in my house. My daughter Sarah was legally married to the chief operating officer. The cartel would inevitably target her to silence the family and send a brutal message. Giving the evidence to the police would spark a chain reaction that would certainly put my innocent daughter in an early grave. Vince stared at me, the grim realization settling heavily across his hardened features. He asked me what other option we had. He reminded me that I was a dead man walking if I went back to my estate, and that Preston was heavily armed with both legal power and lethal poison. I leaned back against the car seat, my mind working with a dark, ruthless precision. I told Vince that we needed to orchestrate a scenario where Preston could not afford to hire lawyers. We needed to put him in a position where the cartel and the federal authorities cornered him at the exact same moment. We needed a perfect storm. I outlined the master plan. We would use the $15 million bait I had dropped at dinner. I knew Preston was desperate to secure those non-existent offshore funds before his cartel deadline expired. I told Vince we would arrange a private meeting with my treacherous son-in-law tonight. We would use one of my isolated commercial shipping warehouses, a location Preston already used for his illicit cartel operations. I would ensure Preston believed he was walking into a quiet, unobserved space to finally force my signature on the transfer documents. But he would actually be walking into an absolute nightmare. Vince would use his old federal contacts to to anonymously tip off the authorities about a massive narcotics shipment arriving at that specific warehouse tonight. At the exact same time, we would leak information to the cartel that Preston was planning to steal their chemical cargo and flee the country with his mistress. We would bring the wolves directly to his doorstep and let them tear him apart. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cellular phone. I dialed the private number of my son-in-law. He answered on the very first ring, his voice dripping with fake concern. He asked how I was feeling, pretending he had not just left me for dead in a hospital bed. I pitched my voice perfectly, making it sound strong, resolved, and completely oblivious to his treachery. I told him that my rest at home had worked wonders. I told him I was feeling much better. I let a brief pause stretch over the line before delivering the final strike. Let us meet at Warehouse 4 tonight at exactly 9 o'clock. Come alone. I have the Cayman Islands transfer documents ready to sign. I ended the call and looked at Vince. The trap was set. The final confrontation was only hours away. I left Vince in the empty industrial park to finalize the tactical preparations for our warehouse encounter. My most pressing concern was no longer the stolen corporate funds or the heavy metal poison slowly coursing through my veins. It was my daughter. I could not allow Sarah to remain inside that sprawling suburban house waiting for a treacherous husband who was never going to return. I needed to pull her out of the blast radius completely before the federal agents and the cartel enforcers descended upon my son-in-law. I drove back to my estate and found Sarah sitting alone in the quiet living room. She was holding a ceramic cup of tea, her eyes red and swollen from crying over my supposed medical crisis earlier today. I told her I needed her to come with me immediately to sign some highly urgent legal documents at a secure location regarding the future of the corporate trust. She did not question my sudden request or my miraculous recovery. She simply grabbed her heavy wool coat and dutifully followed me to my car. We drove in complete silence through the darkening city streets to a highly secure private office suite downtown that Vince occasionally used for sensitive debriefings. The windowless room was entirely sparse, containing only a heavy metal desk, 2 leather chairs, and a secure laptop sitting quietly in the center of the table. I asked Sarah to sit down in the leather chair. My hands were remarkably steady, but my heart was breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. As a father, your primary biological instinct is to shield your child from the horrors of the cruel world. Tonight, I had to be the one to deliver the monster directly to her doorstep. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick stack of medical documents Vince had procured. I placed the official toxicology report regarding my own blood right in front of her. I gently pointed to the elevated lethal levels of thallium recorded on the paper. I watched her read the terrifying medical jargon. Deep confusion slowly crept across her beautiful face. Before she could ask any questions, I placed a second older medical file directly onto the metal desk. It was the heavily redacted autopsy report and the private medical records of her mother from 5 years ago. I showed her the exact same chemical markers, the exact same physical symptoms, and the exact same lethal neurological progression. I pitched my voice incredibly low and remarkably calm, telling her the hardest truth I have ever spoken. I told her that neither her mother nor I had ever suffered from a random neurological disease. We were both intentionally and methodically poisoned. Sarah stared at the sterile white papers, her breathing becoming increasingly shallow and erratic. She looked up at me, her wide eyes desperately begging me to tell her this was all just a horrible, elaborate misunderstanding. I did not give her any false hope. I reached forward and pressed a button on the secure laptop keyboard. Vince had managed to extract several encrypted audio files from the hidden ledger drives we stole from the penthouse safe. The small room instantly filled with the unmistakable smooth voice of Preston. He was not talking about corporate logistics or real estate developments. He was talking intimately to Diana. The audio quality was chillingly crystal clear. I watched my daughter physically recoil in her chair as she heard her supposedly loving husband laughing cruelly with his hidden mistress. I was openly bragging about how incredibly easy it had been to manipulate the poison dosage during the final agonizing weeks of Martha. He complained bitterly about how stubborn I was being, constantly reassuring Diana that the newly increased dose of thallium would ensure my aging heart simply gave out before the end of the current month. He arrogantly called Sarah a naive little girl who would gladly sign over the remaining control of the company the very moment she inherited the final corporate shares. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a shattered, agonizing sob that violently tore through the quiet room. She pushed the heavy leather chair away from the desk, pacing frantically across the small office like a trapped, wounded animal. She shook her head vehemently, utterly refusing to accept the terrifying nightmare playing through the laptop speakers. She yelled that the audio had to be entirely fabricated, that some rival corporate enemy had maliciously altered the recordings to frame him for these horrific crimes. She sobbed uncontrollably, screaming that the man she slept next to every night, the man who held her tightly while she cried bitterly over the freshly dug grave of her mother, could not possibly be a cold-blooded murderer. I stood up slowly and walked over to my devastated daughter. I wrapped my arms securely around her trembling shoulders, holding her incredibly tightly as the crushing, undeniable weight of the betrayal finally broke through her desperate psychological defenses. I let her cry heavily against my chest, absorbing her profound, suffocating grief. I softly reminded her of the private nurse Preston had so forcefully insisted on hiring for Martha. I gently reminded her of the bitter herbal tea he brewed for me every single night. The absolute calculated precision of his cruelty was undeniable. It took nearly a full hour for the violent, breathless tears to finally subside. When Sarah slowly pulled away from my damp chest, the devastating sorrow in her swollen eyes had been entirely replaced by a dark, freezing clarity. She wiped her face deliberately, her jaw setting into a hard, rigid line that looked exactly like her mother when she was ready for a brutal fight. She walked back to the metal desk, staring down at the medical reports with a newfound, terrifying composure that made me incredibly proud. The innocent, trusting girl was gone, replaced by a hardened survivor. She looked at me with cold determination and asked me exactly what I was going to do to the treacherous man who murdered her mother. I told her that Preston and I had a private, highly confidential meeting scheduled at Warehouse 4 tonight to supposedly finalize the fake offshore transfer. I calmly explained that Vince and I were setting an inescapable trap to ensure he never saw the light of day again as a free man. Sarah went completely still. She looked at me, her eyes widening with a sudden, horrifying realization that drained the remaining color from her face. She grabbed my arm, her grip shockingly strong and urgent. She told me that Preston had casually mentioned a massive logistical movement scheduled for tonight, before he left the house. He had confidently told her he was personally overseeing a highly sensitive special cargo transfer arriving at Warehouse 4 at exactly 9 o'clock. The scattered pieces of the puzzle locked together instantly in my mind. The ruthless cartel delivery was actually happening tonight. Preston was not just walking into our trap. I was planning to execute me and move the illegal synthetic narcotics through my commercial property simultaneously. He was bringing the cartel directly to our private meeting. I left the secure downtown office building and navigated my car through the desolate, rain-slicked streets of the industrial district. My daughter was safely hidden away under the protective watch of a trusted associate, her mind grappling with the agonizing destruction of her entire world. I drove toward the southern edge of the city, where the looming shadows of massive commercial shipping hubs dominated the skyline. The heavy autumn fog rolled off the nearby river, wrapping the towering steel structures in a thick, freezing mist. I pulled up to the heavy iron gates of Warehouse 4, a massive facility I had purchased nearly 30 years ago. The sprawling property was completely dark, silent, and supposedly abandoned for the night. I parked my car near the loading docks, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the biting wind. The familiar smell of damp concrete and diesel fuel filled my lungs. I unlocked the heavy side entrance and stepped into the cavernous belly of the warehouse. The interior was a sprawling canyon of steel beams and towering stacks of wooden pallets. Rows of massive metal shipping containers lined the outer walls, creating a labyrinth of deep shadows. Vince had arrived hours earlier to prepare the battlefield. He stepped out from behind a forklift, a small electronic tablet in his hand. He gave me a single, silent nod. The trap was fully operational. Vince had meticulously rigged the massive rolling bay doors to an encrypted digital switch, ensuring they could be locked or opened instantly with a single keystroke. He had spent the afternoon planting high-definition infrared cameras in the steel rafters covering every possible angle of the central loading floor. The live video was currently transmitting directly to a secure cloud server, waiting to be unleashed. He had positioned a single small folding table directly in the center of the vast, empty concrete floor. A lone overhead utility light cast a harsh, glaring circle of illumination over two folding chairs. I walked over to the table and set my heavy leather briefcase down on the metal surface. The briefcase did not contain the $15 million transfer documents Preston was desperately expecting. It contained absolutely nothing but blank sheets of printer paper. Vince patted my shoulder, his expression grim and resolute. He told me he was moving to his hidden overwatch position in the catwalks above. He handed me a small wireless remote control, no larger than a car key, and instructed me to keep it hidden in my palm. The remote was directly linked to the electronic locking mechanisms of the massive bay doors. When the time was right, I would have complete control over the battlefield. I thanked my old friend and watched him disappear silently into the dark scaffolding above. I pulled out one of the metal folding chairs and sat down under the harsh glare of the utility light. I was completely alone in the massive, echoing space. I folded my hands over the leather handle of my briefcase and waited in the freezing silence. As I sat there, the profound weight of my entire life surrounded me. I closed my tired, aging eyes and breathed in the deep, familiar scent of the warehouse. I remembered the exact day I signed the mortgage for this specific building. Martha had stood right beside me, proudly holding a bottle of cheap champagne to celebrate. We had poured our absolute souls into this concrete floor. I had spent decades working alongside my men, unloading trucks, moving heavy pallets, and building a pristine reputation built on honest sweat and unbreakable integrity. We had created a thriving, legitimate empire designed to feed our family and provide a secure future for our daughter. But the man my daughter married had taken this sacred space and twisted it into something vile. Preston had violently desecrated our legacy. He had turned my honest shipping hub into a covert transit point for synthetic narcotics. He had used the wealth generated by this very building to purchase the heavy metal poison that stopped the beating heart of my beautiful wife. He had transformed my proud life work into a weapon of death. The realization did not bring me to tears. It hardened my soul into a solid block of pure, unforgiving ice. I was not just a businessman protecting his assets anymore. I was an executioner waiting for the condemned to arrive. The silence of the warehouse was shattered by the distant crunch of tires on gravel outside. Headlights swept across the frosted glass windows near the ceiling, casting long, frantic shadows across the concrete floor. My pulse quickened, but my breathing remained perfectly steady. I kept my hands folded neatly over the briefcase, projecting an image of calm, unsuspecting vulnerability. I heard the heavy metallic clatter of the exterior loading door being forced open. The cold wind rushed into the cavernous space, carrying the sound of approaching footsteps. But the rhythm of the footsteps was entirely wrong. Preston was supposed to arrive alone, desperate and eager to secure his fabricated $15 million lifeline before his brutal cartel deadline expired tonight. I had anticipated he might bring a corrupt corporate lawyer or a private notary to force the immediate execution of the transfer documents. I did not anticipate the chilling reality stepping out of the shadows. Preston walked into the circle of overhead light. He was not wearing his usual tailored executive suit. He wore a dark leather jacket, his face pale and completely stripped of his usual charming, manipulative smile. His eyes darted nervously around the empty warehouse, radiating a frantic, highly dangerous energy. He was not alone. Walking closely beside him, her face set in a mask of cold arrogance, was Diana. The private nurse who had smiled at me while she slowly murdered my wife had come to witness the final destruction of the husband. But the presence of his wicked mistress was not the most alarming development. Trailing just a few paces behind them were two large, heavily muscled men I had never seen before. They wore dark tactical clothing and moved forward with the silent, chilling, predatory grace of professional violence. One of the men casually rested his right hand over a noticeable, heavy bulge beneath his jacket. The other man stepped to the side, blocking the only viable exit path. The facade of the devoted, caring son-in-law was entirely gone. The corporate mask had been violently ripped away, revealing the desperate, cornered criminal underneath. Preston stopped on the opposite side of the folding table, staring down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated malice. He did not ask about my failing health. He did not offer a fake apology for my hospital visit. He simply slammed his hands flat onto the metal table, his dark eyes locking onto the leather briefcase resting under my calm hands. He leaned forward, his hot breath forming small clouds in the freezing air between us. The trap had been successfully sprung, but the deadly variables had suddenly multiplied. The stage was perfectly set for total destruction, and there was absolutely no turning back for any of us now. The stage was perfectly set for total destruction, and there was absolutely no turning back for any of us now. Preston broke the silence with a sound that chilled me to the bone. He laughed. It was not the polished chuckle he used at board meetings, nor the polite sound he offered my daughter. It was a dark, jagged, and cruel sound echoing off the cold walls of the warehouse. The facade of the devoted son-in-law completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but the arrogant predator I always sensed lurking beneath his tailored suits. He stepped closer to the folding table, a smug smile twisting his features. Diana stood beside him, arms crossed, looking at me with pure contempt. The two muscled enforcers remained standing near the loading doors, their silent presence an undeniable threat of impending violence. Preston reached inside his dark leather jacket. When his hand emerged, the dim overhead utility light caught the dull gleam of a heavy black handgun. He did not point the weapon directly at me immediately. Instead, he rested the barrel casually against the metal edge of the folding table, the threat hanging heavily in the freezing air. He leaned forward, his dark eyes locked onto mine. "Let us skip the pleasantries, Bill," he said, his voice dripping with poisonous condescension. "You have had a very long day at the hospital. I am sure you just want to go home and rest. So open that briefcase. Take out the transfer documents for the Cayman Islands account, sign them on the dotted line, and we can all walk away from this warehouse." I looked at the gun, then up at his face. I did not move my hands. I did not flinch. My lack of fear seemed to confuse him for a fleeting moment, but his blinding greed quickly overrode any lingering caution. He tapped the barrel of the gun against the metal table, the sharp clinking sound echoing loudly in the vast space. "Open the briefcase, Bill," he commanded, his tone hardening into a brutal demand. "Do not make this any more difficult than it needs to be." I remained perfectly seated, keeping my breathing steady and my posture entirely relaxed. "You brought a lot of unnecessary firepower just to secure a signature, Preston," I said quietly. His cruel smile widened into a malicious grin. He shook his head, looking at me with a profound, sickening pity. "You do not understand, do you?" he mocked softly. "You really are just a clueless, broken old man who held onto his empire for far too long. I brought the gun because your signature is the absolute last thing I need from you on this earth. Once those $15 million are legally wired into the corporate trust, your tragic decline in health will reach its inevitable conclusion tonight." He gestured casually toward Diana, who offered a chilling, satisfied smirk. "Diana has been patient." Preston continued, his voice dripping with a twisted pride. She prepared a highly concentrated dose of your herbal tea just for this occasion. We will ensure you slip away quietly, leaving poor Sarah with a massive company. She has no idea how to run and leaving me with the financial freedom I truly deserve. The arrogant audacity of his confession fueled the freezing fire in my veins. I looked directly at Diana, acknowledging her presence for the first time. You played your part perfectly. 5 years ago, I stated, my voice completely devoid of any trembling. The smug smile on her face faltered for a fraction of a second, but Preston simply let out another sharp, mocking laugh. You finally figured it out, did you? He taunted, stepping even closer to the table. Yes, Bill. We did the exact same thing to Martha. I felt a violent primal urge to lunge across the table and wrap my hands around his throat, but I forced my muscles to remain perfectly still. Preston leaned over the table, his face inches from mine, his breath hot in the freezing air. Your beloved wife was too stubborn, Bill, he whispered maliciously. She refused to let go of the company. She refused to trust my vision. She was a constant, irritating obstacle standing in the way of my corporate ascension. So Diana and I simply removed the obstacle. We watched her slowly wither away in her own bed, and you paid us to do it. You literally handed us the keys to your kingdom because you were too blind to see the truth standing right in front of you. He stood up straight, raising the heavy handgun and pointing it directly at the center of my chest. Now open the briefcase and sign the documents, he ordered, his finger resting dangerously on the trigger. I did not beg for my life. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked up at the man who had murdered my beautiful wife, feeling an overwhelming sense of cold, unrelenting justice settling over my soul. I slowly unclasped my hands and reached for the brass locks of the leather briefcase. I snapped them open with 2 loud, echoing clicks. I lifted the lid, pushing the open briefcase across the metal table toward him. Preston eagerly stepped forward, looking down into the case. His dark eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated confusion. He stared at the neat stacks of completely blank printer paper resting inside. There were no financial documents. There were no offshore bank forms. There was absolutely nothing of value. The silence in the warehouse became incredibly dense, suffocatingly thick with his rising panic. He looked up at me, the malicious confidence draining entirely from his pale face. What is this? He demanded, his voice cracking with a sudden intense fear. Where are the transfer documents? I leaned back in my metal folding chair, crossing my arms over my chest. I looked at him with eyes as cold and unforgiving as the frozen concrete floor beneath our feet. There are no transfer documents, Preston. I said, my voice echoing with a dark finality. There is no offshore bank account. The $15 million in the Cayman Islands never existed. It was nothing more than a bedtime story designed specifically to trap a greedy, desperate child. I watched the realization violently crash into his mind. He had completely exposed his murderous crimes, admitted to killing my wife, and brought his heavily armed accomplices into my trap for absolutely nothing. The $8 million he owed to the ruthless synthetic drug cartel was still hanging over his head, and his only fabricated lifeline had just vanished into thin air. His chest began to heave with rapid, panicked breaths. His hands shook violently as the pure, blinding rage completely consumed his rational thought. He let out a furious, animalistic scream, raising the heavy black handgun to execute me right where I sat. But suddenly, the warehouse floor began to vibrate beneath our feet. A loud, deafening, mechanical grinding noise echoed through the cavernous space. Preston froze the gun, trembling in his hand, as the massive steel bay doors behind him slowly began to grind open into the freezing autumn night. The massive steel bay doors groaned with a deafening screech as they slowly began retracting upward. A sudden blast of bitter autumn wind ripped through the cavernous warehouse, carrying the heavy scent of exhaust fumes and impending rain. Preston froze instantly, the black handgun still aimed directly at the center of my chest. His dark eyes darted frantically toward the expanding opening. 3 armored black sport utility vehicles rolled seamlessly into the dark space, their blinding high-beam headlights piercing through the thick fog and casting chaotic shadows across the cold concrete floor. The vehicles moved with a predatory precision, fanning out in a tight semicircle that completely blocked the exit. The heavy doors of the lead vehicle swung open before the powerful engine even cut off. 5 large men stepped out into the harsh glare of the overhead lights. They did not look anything like the polished corporate lawyers my son-in-law was accustomed to intimidating. They wore dark tactical gear, their cold faces hardened by years of surviving in a brutal criminal underworld. Walking directly at the center of the dangerous group was the man I had seen earlier that morning in my corporate office, the ruthless cartel enforcer. He stepped forward with deliberate confidence, a suppressed automatic weapon resting casually against his thigh. The shift in the atmospheric pressure of the massive warehouse was absolutely terrifying. Preston was no longer the apex predator boasting about his murderous conquests. He was instantly reduced to a cornered, violently trembling rat, trapped securely inside a steel cage of his own desperate making. I remained perfectly seated in my metal folding chair, my hands resting calmly over the empty leather briefcase sitting on the table. I had explicitly instructed Vince to make the anonymous phone call exactly 45 minutes ago. Vince had utilized a highly encrypted federal channel to bypass their sophisticated security network, leaving a very specific, undeniable message for the cartel leadership. He warned them that their compromised corporate insider, the chief operating officer of Harrison Commercial Real Estate, was actively planning to steal their valuable incoming chemical cargo tonight. The anonymous tip meticulously detailed exactly how Preston intended to take the stolen narcotics permanently, abandon his staggering $8 million debt, and immediately board a private charter flight to a non-extradition country with his hidden mistress. The cartel did not take kindly to treason, and they took missing money even more seriously than betrayal. The enforcer stopped exactly 10 feet away from our folding table, his hollow eyes locking directly onto Preston. The thick, oppressive silence of the warehouse was broken only by the dangerous rumble of the idling vehicle engines. "Put the gun down." Preston, the enforcer, commanded, his voice barely rising above a coarse whisper, yet echoing with an undeniable lethal authority. "We received a very interesting, detailed phone call tonight about a cowardly rat planning to jump ship with our precious cargo. You have exactly 10 seconds to tell me where my $8 million are hidden right now, or I am going to let my men dismantle you and your pathetic girlfriend piece by piece right here on this freezing concrete floor." The remaining color completely drained from the face of my son-in-law. His pale hand shook so violently that I could hear the internal metallic components of his handgun rattling together. He desperately swung the barrel of the weapon away from my chest, pointing it wildly toward the advancing cartel members. "Wait," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic pitch of pure terror. "You do not understand what is happening here. This is a setup. The crazy old man is lying to you to save his own skin. I am not stealing anything from the organization. I swear to you. I came here tonight specifically to secure the money I owe you. I have a massive offshore account transfer finalizing right now." The enforcer let out a dark, utterly humorless laugh, gesturing slowly toward the open, empty leather briefcase resting on the table between us. "It looks like your fancy offshore transfer is a little light tonight, Preston," he mocked coldly, taking another slow step forward. His heavily armed men simultaneously raised their suppressed weapons, taking precise aim directly at the chest of my son-in-law. The grim reality of his inescapable situation finally shattered the last remaining fragment of his arrogant corporate composure. I was standing completely alone between a man he had ruthlessly poisoned and the most violent criminal syndicate in the entire city, holding a worthless, empty briefcase and an $8 million death sentence. Diana suddenly let out a piercing, hysterical scream that echoed painfully off the steel rafters. The polished, cruel woman who had calmly watched my beautiful wife die in absolute agony was now weeping uncontrollably. She frantically clutched the sleeve of the dark leather jacket Preston wore, desperately begging the armed men to simply let her walk away. I sat back in my chair, watching the chaotic destruction of the monsters who had infiltrated my family. For 5 agonizing years, I had carried the crushing weight of guilt, wrongly believing I had somehow failed to protect Martha from a tragic illness. Tonight I was watching the universe deliver brutal, unyielding justice before my eyes. Preston was trying to negotiate his survival, his voice breaking into frantic sobs as he offered the cartel full ownership of my shipping network, blindly promising them control of company assets he did not legally possess anymore. The enforcer simply shook his head, his face remaining an emotionless mask of absolute violence. He told Preston that the corporate logistics network was already compromised by his sloppy management, and that the only currency the cartel accepted for such betrayal was blood. The armed men took another synchronized step forward, tightening the circle around the trembling couple. Diana dropped to her knees on the concrete, sobbing, hysterically abandoning the man she had conspired with for over 6 years. Preston gripped his handgun with both hands, swinging it erratically between the cartel soldiers, losing control of his senses and his environment. I knew my role in this specific act of the play had officially concluded. I slowly pushed my chair back from the metal folding table and stood up. The movement drew the attention of the cartel enforcer for a brief, tense second. He looked at me, a silent understanding passing between us. He knew I was the architect of this trap, and he did not care, as long as he got the desperate traitor he came to punish. I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat and closed my fingers tightly around the small wireless remote control Vince had given me tonight. I pressed my thumb against the central button. A loud chirp echoed through the steel rafters, instantly followed by the heavy grinding sound of the doors slamming shut and locking with a definitive thud. I looked at the broken man who married my daughter and destroyed my wife. "You boys sort out your debts," I said, my voice cutting through the panic with absolute calm. "I have a big company to run." The heavy metallic echo of the electronic locks engaging sealed the vast warehouse in an inescapable vault of cold dread. Preston and Diana froze in absolute terror. The color drained entirely from their faces as the terrifying reality of their situation finally crushed the last remaining fragments of their arrogant delusions. Preston stood trembling violently, the heavy black handgun drooping in his sweaty grip, his eyes darting frantically between the locked steel bay doors and the heavily armed cartel soldiers encircling him. Diana pressed her hands against her mouth, choking back her hysterical sobs, completely paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming proximity of brutal violence. The cartel enforcer slowly turned his broad shoulders away from my son-in-law, his hollow, dangerous eyes locking directly onto me. He did not appreciate being locked inside a concrete cage, and his professional patience was rapidly evaporating. He took a slow, menacing step toward my metal folding table, raising the barrel of his suppressed automatic weapon. He demanded to know exactly who I was and why I had trapped his men inside a federal trap. I did not flinch under the intense glare of the cartel enforcer. I calmly reached my hand inside the inner pocket of my tailored wool coat. Preston gasped, instinctively shrinking back, perhaps expecting me to draw a weapon of my own. Instead, I pulled out a thick, tightly bound stack of folded papers. I tossed them casually onto the center of the metal folding table. The heavy thud of the documents hitting the steel surface echoed sharply in the tense silence. I looked directly at the cartel enforcer, maintaining a perfectly steady, unyielding gaze. I told him to look closely at the papers resting on the table before he made a fatal decision. The enforcer narrowed his eyes, gesturing for one of his armed men to step forward and inspect the documents. The soldier carefully flipped open the heavy manila folder, shining a small tactical flashlight over the printed pages. Resting on top of the stack was the official, heavily stamped laboratory toxicology report, detailing the lethal concentrations of heavy metal poison currently circulating in my bloodstream. Positioned directly beneath that terrifying medical document were the meticulously transcribed audio recordings of Preston and Diana callously plotting my agonizing murder. I watched the eyes of the cartel enforcer scan the damning evidence. I told him that the pathetic, trembling man standing before him was not a criminal mastermind or a reliable logistics partner. I was a desperate, sloppy coward who poisoned dying women and routinely stole from his own family, just to maintain a fragile illusion of wealth. I explained that Preston had systematically brought federal heat directly down upon their covert transportation network, and that executing me right now would only guarantee their total destruction. The enforcer stared at me, a cold realization slowly hardening his brutal features. He slowly lowered his suppressed weapon, silently acknowledging that I was not the enemy he needed to eliminate tonight. Preston desperately tried to interject, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He frantically begged the cartel members to ignore my words wildly, promising them absolute control over my entire shipping empire if they simply helped him dispose of my body right now. He pointed his trembling handgun directly at my chest, his finger tightening dangerously around the trigger mechanism. But before he could commit his final, irreversible act of violence, the deafening roar of grinding metal violently shattered the oppressive silence of the warehouse. The massive secondary loading doors on the far side of the building suddenly burst open with explosive, overwhelming force. Blinding high-intensity tactical spotlights flooded the dark concrete floor, instantly turning the shadowy warehouse into a glaring arena of brilliant white light. A dozen heavily armored federal agents and state police officers stormed into the building, their assault rifles raised and aimed with absolute lethal precision. Leading the tactical assault was Vincent Gallagher, his retired badge replaced by the undeniable authority of the federal raid he had perfectly orchestrated. "Drop the weapons right now," Vince roared, his commanding voice amplified by a heavy megaphone. "Nobody moves a single muscle. The federal authorities have surrounded the entire perimeter of this facility." The tactical execution of the raid was absolutely flawless. The cartel soldiers immediately recognized that they were hopelessly outgunned and entirely outmaneuvered. They slowly lowered their automatic weapons to the freezing concrete floor, raising their hands in silent, bitter surrender. The enforcer offered me one last piercing look of dark respect before dropping to his knees. Preston, however, remained entirely frozen in a state of profound, catastrophic shock. The heavy handgun slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering loudly against the cold floor. Diana collapsed beside him, burying her face in her hands, as the federal agents swiftly moved in to secure the perimeter. Vince walked directly toward the metal folding table flanked by two heavily armed state police officers. He looked down at Preston, a grim, deeply satisfied smile playing across his hardened features. Vince nodded at me silently, confirming that the massive operation had been executed perfectly. I slowly stood up from my metal folding chair, buttoning my tailored wool coat with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I walked around the folding table, my polished shoes clicking sharply against the concrete, until I was standing less than 2 feet away from the trembling, broken shell of my son-in-law. Preston looked up at me, his dark eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic plea for mercy. He stammered frantically, begging me to call off the federal agents, promising he would return every single stolen dollar, swearing he would disappear forever if I just let him walk away tonight. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, pristine emptiness. "You truly thought you had outsmarted everyone, Preston," I said, my voice echoing with a dark, unrelenting finality. "You believed you could poison me, steal my entire legacy, and quietly sell this very warehouse to a private commercial entity named Zenith Corporation for $40 million. You thought that massive sale would perfectly cover your tracks, fund your escape, and quietly pay off the $8 million debt you accumulated with the syndicate." The color completely drained from his face as I casually revealed his ultimate, deeply hidden escape plan. He stared at me in absolute horror, completely unable to comprehend how I knew the intricate details of his secret real estate negotiations. I leaned in close, ensuring he heard every single word of his total destruction. "I am Zenith Preston," I whispered coldly. "I created the shell company. I orchestrated the fake purchase offers to keep you distracted. And as of yesterday afternoon, my lawyers officially purchased your massive debt directly from the syndicate leadership. You owe me those $12 million. And since you just committed international wire fraud, horrific elder abuse, and attempted murder across state lines, you are going to pay me back every single penny from a cold, dark federal prison cell." His tired, empty eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the frozen floor, utterly defeated. I simply turned my back and walked away from the miserable wreckage. The heavy thud of Preston falling to his knees echoed loudly through the cavernous warehouse. He crawled frantically across the freezing concrete floor, reaching out with desperate, trembling hands to grab the hem of my tailored wool coat. He wept with the unrestrained, pathetic agony of a man who finally realized his manipulative charms were entirely useless. He begged me to show mercy, loudly sobbing that he truly loved my daughter and that he was violently manipulated by the cartel into committing those crimes against our family. He pleaded for a second chance, frantically promising to dedicate the rest of his miserable life to making absolute amends for the horrific pain he caused. I did not look down at his tear-stained face, nor did I ever offer a single word of false comfort to the treacherous, deceitful monster who had so mercilessly destroyed the sacred peace of my family. I simply pulled my coat free from his grasping fingers and stepped aside as two heavily armored federal agents forcefully hauled him to his feet, reading him his constitutional rights. Across the cold concrete floor, Diana let out a piercing, hysterical scream as the heavy steel handcuffs clicked sharply around her slender wrists. She kicked and thrashed against the state police officers, wildly accusing Preston of forcing her to administer the heavy metal poison to my beautiful wife. The polished, arrogant private nurse who had comfortably lived in a luxury downtown penthouse, funded entirely by my stolen corporate money, was now a frantic, terrified criminal, facing a bleak lifetime behind cold iron bars. I stood near the massive steel bay doors alongside my good friend Vince, watching the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminate the heavy autumn fog rolling off the dark river. The dangerous cartel enforcer and his heavily armed soldiers were already securely shackled in the back of an armored federal transport vehicle. I watched the stoic federal agents forcefully drag Preston and Diana out into the freezing rain, shoving them roughly into the back of separate patrol cars. As the heavy metal doors slammed shut, firmly trapping them inside, a profound and absolute sense of healing closure washed over my tired soul. The suffocating, toxic cloud that had mercilessly choked my family for 5 agonizing years was finally lifting. I walked out to my car, climbed into the driver's seat, and drove away from the commercial warehouse, leaving the flashing police lights and the completely shattered remnants of their cruel criminal conspiracy far behind me in the freezing dark night. Fast forward 6 agonizing but deeply healing months. The federal trial was a massive, highly publicized spectacle that laid bare every single dark detail of the monstrous betrayal. I sat proudly in the front row of the crowded courtroom, every single day, tightly holding the hand of my daughter Sarah as we listened to the horrific audio recordings and the devastating toxicology reports presented by the skilled federal prosecutors. Sarah demonstrated an incredible, absolutely unbreakable inner strength throughout the entire exhausting emotional ordeal, sitting perfectly upright and refusing to shed a single tear for the traitor. She filed for an expedited divorce, fought fiercely and successfully for total legal custody of her young son, and permanently severed every single legal and financial tie to the treacherous man who murdered her beloved mother. The stern federal judge showed absolutely no mercy to the convicted defendants during the final sentencing hearing. Preston was rightfully convicted of international wire fraud, extensive elder abuse, and attempted murder across state lines. He was sentenced to 15 grueling years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the slightest possibility of early parole. Diana faced the brutal reality of her direct, undeniable involvement in the cruel poisoning of my late wife. She broke down completely on the witness stand, sobbing and confessing to everything, in a desperate, ultimately futile bid for a significantly reduced sentence. The judge handed her 8 years in federal prison, for Diana was convicted of second-degree murder, attempted murder, criminal conspiracy, and evidence tampering. The brutal synthetic drug cartel that Preston foolishly thought he could easily manipulate was systematically dismantled by the dedicated federal authorities using the encrypted logistics ledgers Vince and I had bravely extracted from the hidden penthouse safe, the massive sprawling corporate logistics empire. I bravely built from a single rusted pickup truck managed to seamlessly survive the devastating public scandal without losing any market value. Our loyal commercial clients stood by us, recognizing that the reputable company was an unfortunate victim of a rogue executive rather than a corrupt institution. I officially stepped down from my demanding role as the chief executive officer, placing the entire management of the company into the highly capable hands of my resilient daughter. Sarah proved to be a brilliant, exceptionally compassionate leader, guiding our vast logistics network into a brand new era of unprecedented financial prosperity and absolute corporate transparency. This beautiful morning, I woke up early and walked out onto the sprawling wooden porch of my magnificent suburban estate. I took a deep, grounding breath of the crisp, clean autumn air sweeping across the landscape. The lingering physical effects of the heavy metal poison have finally been completely purged from my aging body, leaving me with a renewed sense of vibrant, youthful energy and profound gratitude for every single day I am allowed to live on this earth. I poured myself a hot cup of black coffee, leaving the bitter herbal supplements far behind me in the dark past. I looked out over the meticulously manicured green lawns, listening to the joyful, carefree laughter of my young grandson playing happily near the blooming garden. To properly honor the beautiful, enduring memory of my late wife, I established the Martha Harrison Foundation. I personally donated $20 million of my recovered private wealth to create a comprehensive charity dedicated entirely to protecting vulnerable seniors from horrific financial exploitation and cruel medical abuse. We hired elite legal teams, seasoned private investigators, and dedicated social workers to ensure that absolutely no other aging parent would ever have to suffer in terrifying silence at the hands of a greedy, manipulative relative. As I stood there, holding my warm ceramic coffee mug, feeling the bright morning sun radiating on my face, a deep, comforting realization settled permanently into my heart. I had spent so many sleepless nights terrified that exposing the horrific crimes of my wicked son-in-law would permanently destroy the proud legacy of my family. But I was entirely wrong. Excising the toxic poison from my life did not destroy my cherished legacy at all. It beautifully and permanently purified it. The foundation of my empire is no longer built on blind trust and polite deception. It is built on absolute truth, unwavering accountability, and the fierce, protective love of a father who absolutely refused to be a helpless victim. I smiled warmly, taking a slow sip of my dark coffee, knowing that my empire and my wonderful family were finally safe, forever standing strong and completely united against the darkest shadows that had once foolishly tried to consume us entirely. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and unconditional love should never be a blindfold against the truth. We spend our lives building foundations to protect our children, assuming they will protect us when we become fragile. True character is revealed not when someone is handed the world, but when they believe they hold absolute power over the vulnerable. Never underestimate the sharp mind of a seasoned elder. Forgiveness is a virtue, but strict accountability is a necessity. Protect your legacy. Guard your mind, and always remember that sometimes the most profound act of love is allowing a monster to face consequences. If my ruthless pursuit of justice satisfied you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible life stories. Have you ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life? Share your own experience in the comments below. Let us support each other.